All right, let me jump right into what happened. I was 10 when my parents separated, and saying I didn't handle it well is an understatement. Honestly, what kid would cope well with that? But for me, it hit especially hard. Looking back, maybe they just fell out of love, but at that age, all I could understand was that the two people I depended on most suddenly didn't want to be together anymore. I remember feeling constantly confused and angry, often lashing out at both of them, mostly at my dad. I couldn't quite explain why, but I blamed him for ruining everything. We tried the usual things, like counseling, but honestly, it was a waste of time. My mom seemed like the only one who genuinely tried to understand me and where I was coming from. My dad, on the other hand, had a toughen-up attitude. He didn't understand how much pain I was in, and if I'm being honest, I don't think he even cared. He was more focused on holding it together for himself than considering what I was going through. Maybe that's just how he dealt with things. After that, our relationship never really recovered, and it felt like we became strangers living under the same roof. I mainly stayed with my mom, which suited me since we were always closer. I only visited my dad's place on weekends or for short breaks. I won't lie, I dreaded those weekends. They were uncomfortable, and I never felt like I truly fit in there anymore. But things changed when I turned 14, and my mom decided to remarry. Don't get me wrong, I wanted her to be happy, but her new husband, let's call him Mike, didn't seem thrilled about having me around. I couldn't tell if it was me specifically, or if he just didn't want a kid that wasn't his, but it was obvious that I wasn't welcome. And then, out of nowhere, my mom made a choice. She chose her new life with him over me. I can't even begin to describe the feeling. It was like she went from being my support system, the only one who truly understood me, to pushing me away. She claimed it was for the best and suggested I live with my dad. Sure, for her best. I was devastated. I felt abandoned. Like, how do you go from being the most important person in someone's life to being cast aside because their new partner doesn't want to deal with you? It didn't make sense to me then, and honestly, it still doesn't now. So I packed up my things and moved in with my dad and his fiancée, Olivia. Now, Olivia was a challenge. She had been with my dad for a while and seemed to think she could just step in and take on a motherly role. I wasn't open to that idea at all. I was still dealing with being left behind by my actual mom, and now this woman was acting like everything was perfectly fine. I shut that down fast. I didn't need or want another mother, especially not one who didn't understand me or my situation. My dad, of course, didn't seem to notice or care about how I was feeling. He was too caught up in playing house with Olivia to see that I was struggling. To him, it was like I should just get over it, move on, and adjust to the new family setup. But how was I supposed to adapt when my entire life had been turned upside down? Living with them was miserable, plain and simple. Every day felt like I was just trying to make it through in a place where I didn't belong. Olivia was constantly around, trying to get me to open up or join in on family activities, but I had no interest. The more she tried, the more I pulled back. And my dad, he acted like everything was fine, like my presence there didn't change anything. Meanwhile, I was grieving the fact that my mom had effectively replaced me with a man who didn't even want me around. There were moments when I thought about running away, just leaving to see where I'd end up. It was that bad. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed, kept my head down, and counted the days until I could leave for good. I buried myself in school, aimed for college, and saw that as my escape. I figured if I could just make it to college, I'd finally be free. Somehow I managed to get through high school without completely losing my mind, but living with Olivia and my dad was tough. Every day was filled with tension. There weren't any major arguments, but the awkwardness was always there. I constantly felt like I didn't belong. Olivia never outright mistreated me, but she had a way of making me feel like I was a burden, like everything would be smoother if I weren't around. She never said it directly, but I could sense it. Then there was Jess, her daughter. Initially, she wasn't the problem. Jess was okay, we weren't close, but she wasn't difficult to deal with either. It was just awkward because Olivia always went out of her way to make Jess the center of attention. Jess got preferential treatment in everything, from sports teams to school events. Whatever Jess wanted, Olivia made it happen. And Jess just accepted it. She wasn't spoiled, but she didn't resist either. She just took for granted that her mom would always make things easier for her. Meanwhile, I was just in the background, trying not to cause trouble. Living there felt like staying in someone else's home. My dad had his new life with Olivia, and I was just an extra. Sure, I had a room, but it never felt like mine, more like a spare room they let me use. I kept myself busy with school and stayed away from the house as much as possible, hanging out at friends' places or staying late at the library, anything to avoid being home. But things got more complicated when Jess started acting differently. It seemed like overnight she went from being just Olivia's daughter who I tolerated to always hanging around, especially when I had friends over, particularly Ethan. I realize I haven't mentioned Ethan yet, but this is where he comes in. Ethan and I started dating when I was in college. We both studied at USC, and things between us were going great. He's a great guy, and I really liked him, so naturally, I started bringing him over to my dad's house sometimes. At first, everything seemed fine, but then, out of nowhere, Jess began acting strangely around him. She'd become super shy and quiet, which was totally unlike her. Initially, I didn't think much of it. I just assumed she was having a rough day or something. But it didn't stop. Every time Ethan came over, Jess would act all flustered, like a middle schooler with a crush. She'd linger around when we tried to talk, ask him random questions, and just stay nearby. It got pretty awkward, but I didn't want to make a scene. I assumed it would eventually pass, except I was wrong. It only got worse. Jess became outright obsessed with Ethan. She started finding excuses to be around whenever he was there or would just show up when we were hanging out. I even caught her staring at him a few times, which was extremely uncomfortable, and I had no clue how to handle it. What was I supposed to do? Tell my dad that his fiance's daughter had a crush on my boyfriend? That conversation wouldn't end well, and I knew it. So I tried to handle it on my own. I took Jess aside one day and directly asked her if she had feelings for Ethan. She looked like she wished she could disappear, but she didn't deny it. She just nodded slightly, avoiding eye contact. I told her this was really uncomfortable for me and that she needed to back off. I thought that would be enough to end it, but I was wrong. Things only got worse. Jess started acting all dramatic after our talk. Her grades dropped and she moped around the house like she was heartbroken. I'd hear her crying at night, and naturally Olivia noticed. Instead of handling things with Jess like a regular parent, Olivia decided that somehow this whole mess was my fault. She cornered me in the kitchen one day, accusing me of flaunting my relationship with Ethan just to make Jess feel bad. Seriously, how was it my fault that Jess had feelings for my boyfriend? It was absurd, but Olivia was completely serious. She told me I needed to be more sensitive and suggested that maybe I should stop bringing Ethan around for Jess's sake. Yeah, that wasn't going to happen. I told her straight up that I wasn't going to stop seeing Ethan just because Jess had a crush on him. If anything, Jess needed to learn how to deal with her feelings like a grown-up, not expect me to rearrange my life to make her feel better. Olivia didn't like my response, so she went straight to my dad. Now, my dad has always been the type to shy away from conflict, so naturally he tried to mediate. He sat me down one evening and gave me this whole lecture about how I needed to be more understanding and suggested that maybe I should take a break from seeing Ethan for a while, for the sake of the family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad was seriously proposing that I distance myself from my boyfriend just because Jess had a crush on him. I couldn't help it. I laughed right in his face. I didn't mean to, but it was so ridiculous that I couldn't hold it in. I told him there was no way I was going to end my relationship just because Olivia and Jess couldn't deal with their feelings. That conversation quickly escalated into a huge argument. My dad kept insisting that I needed to consider Jess's feelings and that I was making things harder for everyone. I just kept saying that it wasn't my problem. I wasn't going to change my life to make things easier for them. If Jess couldn't handle being around Ethan, that was her issue, not mine. By the end of it, it was obvious that things weren't going to improve. My dad took Olivia's side, and I wasn't about to cave to their demands. The tension in the house was unbearable after that. I couldn't even look at Jess without feeling frustrated, and every time Olivia spoke, it was just to make passive-aggressive comments about how tough things were for Jess. That's when I realized I couldn't stay there any longer. This wasn't my home anymore, and to be honest, it probably never was. My dad had chosen his new life with Olivia and Jess, and I was just the outsider. I needed to leave, and quickly. So, that's how everything fell apart with Jess, Olivia, and my dad. It felt like all the tension had been building up to that point. And once we reached it, there was no going back. I was done with the drama and done with feeling like I didn't belong. It was time to make a move, and I knew I had to act fast. After that whole disaster with Jess and Olivia, things at my dad's house only got worse. It was like living in a pressure cooker, waiting for the next blow up. Every day was tense and uncomfortable. When I wasn't at school, I tried to be anywhere but home because it was just too much to handle. But then, things escalated even further, and I realized I needed to get out for good. I probably should have seen it coming, but it still caught me off guard. One night, my dad asked me to join a family meeting. If you've ever been part of a dysfunctional family, you know those words are usually a bad sign. I wasn't looking forward to it, but I thought, fine, let's just get this over with. We all gathered in the living room, my dad, Olivia, Jess, and me. From the expressions on their faces, I knew this was going to be some sort of intervention. My dad began with a speech about how the tension in the house was affecting everyone, and that we needed to find a way to get along better. I just sat there, nodding along, waiting for him to get to the point. Then Olivia jumped in, talking about how Jess had been having a tough time lately, which I already knew, and how the situation with Ethan wasn't helping. I thought, here we go again. But instead of sticking to the usual blame game, she dropped a bomb on me. We think it would be best if you took a break from seeing Ethan for a while. I almost laughed again seriously. We were back to this? But she wasn't finished. Olivia went on, explaining that Jess needed time to sort through her feelings, and that my relationship with Ethan was distracting her from focusing on her own life. She made it sound like I was somehow responsible for Jess struggling in school or something, which was total nonsense. At that point, I couldn't hold back anymore. I said, you can't be serious. You want me to put my life on hold because Jess has a crush on my boyfriend. How is that my problem? I snapped. Olivia didn't take it well. Her expression tightened, and my dad stepped in to support her, saying they weren't asking me to break up with Ethan, just to give things some space. I told them flat out that it wasn't going to happen. There was no chance I'd stop seeing Ethan just because Jess couldn't deal with it. If she had an issue, she needed to work through it herself instead of dragging everyone else into it. After that, the room fell silent. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jess, who had been staring at the floor the whole time, suddenly looked up at me with tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I hadn't expected that. I knew Jess had a crush on Ethan, but seeing her so genuinely upset made me hesitate for a moment. But Olivia jumped back in, twisting the knife by saying, we just want what's best for everyone, especially for Jess. Sometimes we all need to make sacrifices for the family. By then, I had reached my limit. Sacrifices, I snapped. What have you sacrificed, Olivia? All I've done since moving in is try to stay out of your way. I've given up enough, and I'm not giving up Ethan too. My dad sat there for a long moment, saying nothing. He just looked exhausted and worn down, as if he didn't want to be a part of this discussion anymore. Finally, he sighed and said, we're just trying to make things work, that's all. We don't want to force you into anything, but we can't keep living with this tension. I stared at him, wondering how he couldn't see how messed up this whole situation was. I'd always known he struggled with emotions, but this was a new level of avoidance. Rather than addressing the real problem, they were all just blaming me. I stood up, and the words came out before I could even think, I can't do this anymore. I'm done. As soon as I said it, I knew it was true. I couldn't stay there any longer. Living with them was making me angry and bitter, and I deserved better than that. I didn't know where I'd go or how I'd manage, but I couldn't stay. Olivia looked at my dad, stunned that I'd actually said it. Jess just sat there, her face crumpling as she looked miserable, and my dad, he didn't even try to stop me. He just nodded like he'd expected it all along. Then he said, if you don't break up with Ethan, I can't let you live here. Fine, I replied. I'll be out by the end of the week, and that was that. I walked out of the room, went to my space, and started packing. I had no idea where I would go, but I began putting my things into boxes anyway. Part of me was furious, but another part felt relieved. At least I wouldn't have to deal with their nonsense anymore. I could just leave it behind. Over the next few days, I packed up everything I owned. I barely spoke to anyone in the house. Olivia acted like she didn't care, and Jess kept her distance, likely embarrassed by the entire situation. My dad tried talking to me once, but it was the same old speech, trying to smooth things over without addressing the real issues. I didn't tell him where I was going when I left, and I didn't think he even cared. The day I moved out, I loaded up my car, took one last look at the house, and then drove off without glancing back. Leaving wasn't easy. I felt scared and uncertain about what would come next. But I also knew that staying there wasn't an option. My dad had made his choice, picking his new family over me, and I wasn't about to stay where I wasn't valued. I didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but I knew one thing for sure: I was finished with the toxic situation my life had become in that house. It was time to figure out who I was and what I wanted, without them weighing me down. It was time to start living for myself, not for them. After leaving my dad's house, I felt a strange mix of relief and outright panic. I had no real plan and no permanent place to stay, but I knew I couldn't remain in that toxic environment any longer. It felt like stepping out of a pressure cooker. Things might have calmed down for a moment, but now I had to figure out how to survive on my own. At first, I crashed at my friend Kayla's place. She lived in a tiny apartment not far from campus, and she was kind enough to let me stay there temporarily while I sorted things out. I didn't want to impose, so I promised her it was just for a short while, until I could get back on my feet. I started job hunting immediately, even though I was still in school. I knew I'd need to earn some money to cover rent and expenses. Those first few weeks were tough. I picked up shifts at a 24-hour diner, mostly working late nights and weekends. It wasn't an ideal job, but it paid enough to keep me going. Between working, attending classes, and studying, I barely had time to think, and honestly, that was probably for the best. But every so often, when things got quiet, I'd find myself thinking about everything that had happened with my family. It was hard not to feel hurt and lost. I knew I made the right choice by leaving, but that didn't make it any easier to accept that my dad had chosen Olivia and Jess over me. It hurt deeply, like I had been written out of his life, replaced. And the worst part? He never reached out after I left, not a single call or message to see if I was okay. It was as if I had vanished, and he didn't care enough to check in. That stung more than I wanted to admit, but I tried not to dwell on it. I had to focus on building my own life without relying on him. After about a month of crashing at Kayla's, I finally found a small studio apartment that I could afford. It wasn't much, just a single room with a bathroom and a tiny kitchen, but it was mine. It felt incredible to finally have a space of my own, a place where I didn't have to tiptoe around others. That first night, I remember lying on the floor, no furniture, yet feeling an enormous wave of relief. For the first time in ages, I felt like I could truly breathe. But of course, life wasn't going to let me off that easy. About 2 weeks after I moved in, I got a text from my dad. It was short and impersonal, almost like he was writing to a coworker. He wrote something like, "Hope you're doing well. Let me know when you have time to talk." That was it. No apology, no expression of missing me, just a detached message that felt more like an obligation than a genuine attempt to reconnect. I stared at that message for a long while, trying to process my feelings about it. Part of me considered replying, maybe opening a line of communication and possibly fixing things. But the other part of me, the part that was still hurt and angry, wanted to ignore it completely. Why should I be the one to reach out when he hadn't bothered to check on me for weeks? Why should I care when he clearly didn't? In the end, I decided not to respond. It wasn't about being spiteful or trying to punish him. It was more about wondering what the point would be. What could we say to each other that would fix everything? I wasn't ready to go back to that mess, and honestly, I wasn't sure I ever would be. Instead, I threw myself into work and school, staying busy nonstop and focusing on moving forward. It wasn't easy, but it felt good to be working on something for myself. I wasn't living under anyone else's roof or dealing with their drama. This was my life now, and I was determined to make it work. Ethan was a huge support during that time. He never pushed me about the whole family situation, but he was always there when I needed to vent or just hang out to take my mind off things. He'd come over to my place after his classes, and we'd sit on the floor, still no furniture, by the way, and talk about anything but my family. It was comforting to have someone who understood me without the baggage. But even as I tried to move forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, my situation with my dad kept weighing on me. I hated that I still cared, that a part of me wanted him to call or show up at my door, apologizing for everything and asking me to come back. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Weeks turned into months, and eventually, I settled into a routine. The diner job wasn't great, but it covered the bills, and I managed to keep up with my classes. Kayla and I remained close, and Ethan stayed by my side. I was starting to feel like I had some control over my life again. Yet, every now and then, when I was alone in that quiet little apartment, a nagging thought would creep in: what if I'd made a mistake? What if cutting my dad out wasn't the right decision? I kept reminding myself that I did what I had to do, that I couldn't stay in such a toxic situation. And sure, that was true. But still, it's never easy to walk away from your family, no matter how bad things get. There's always that voice in your head wondering if there was another way, if things could have turned out differently. But I pushed those thoughts away, reminding myself that I finally had control over my own life. I didn't have to answer to anyone but myself, and that freedom was something I hadn't felt in years. Even though it was difficult, I knew deep down that I'd made the right decision. So that's where I found myself living in my tiny apartment, working long shifts, and trying to figure out my next steps. I hadn't heard from my dad or Olivia since that text, and honestly, I was fine with that. I was starting to build something for myself, and it felt pretty good. Things got messy after I left, but what really caught me off guard was how much worse it got for them. I never expected their lives to fall apart the way they did it. It was almost as if karma had been waiting for the right time to strike. A few months after I completely cut ties with my dad, Olivia, and Jess, I started hearing bits and pieces about what was going on with them. I wasn't trying to keep tabs or anything, but mutual friends and old neighbors would mention things in passing. From what I gathered, their picture-perfect life was slowly coming undone. It began with small things, arguments between my dad and Olivia, increased tension at home, but soon it escalated. Apparently, after I left, Jess went off the deep end. She wasn't just sulking over her unreturned feelings for Ethan anymore, she completely spiraled. She dropped out of college not long after I moved out. Initially, it seemed like she was just taking a break, but the truth was that she couldn't handle the pressure without Olivia constantly smoothing things over for her. With Olivia unable to shield her, Jess had to face the challenges of real life on her own, and she struggled. She started hanging around with the wrong crowd and getting into trouble. It got so bad that even Olivia, who used to treat Jess like she was fragile, couldn't control her anymore. That's when their home went from being tense to absolute chaos. Olivia was in a panic as she watched her perfect little girl slip out of her control, and my dad was stuck in the middle, trying to keep the peace like always. But this time, it wasn't working. I heard that Jess ended up getting arrested twice. The first time was for shoplifting, and Olivia managed to pull some strings with a lawyer friend to get her out of it. But the second time was more serious. Jess got caught with drugs at a party, and there was no easy way out of that. She faced real charges, and Olivia couldn't just buy her way out of the situation. From what I heard, this was the last straw for my dad. He had already been struggling with Olivia's control issues and Jess's meltdown, but now, with legal trouble and their reputations on the line, he finally snapped. The arguments between them became constant shouting matches, doors slamming, the whole 9 yards. And the ironic thing was, Olivia had no one to blame but herself. She had created this mess, but instead of owning up to it, she tried to shift the blame onto my dad, accusing him of not being supportive enough or failing to lead the family. Classic deflection. Then came the financial meltdown. I heard from some old neighbors that my dad had made a series of poor investments, pushed by Olivia's insistence on expanding their wealth. Olivia had always been obsessed with appearances, having the biggest house, the latest car, and of course outshining my mom. She pressured my dad into investing in a shady real estate deal, convinced they'd see a quick return. Spoiler alert, it didn't go as planned. They lost a significant amount of money, almost all of my dad's savings. The home they lived in was now at risk, teetering on the edge of foreclosure. Olivia had spent years keeping up a facade of luxury, and now everything was falling apart around them. My dad, who had worked tirelessly his whole life to secure some form of stability, now faced the real threat of having nothing. And guess what? Olivia bailed. Yep, when the going got tough, she packed her things and left. She wasn't about to stick around to face the aftermath of the disaster she had a hand in creating. From what I gathered, she ran off with some guy who had more money, someone she met through her high-end social circle. It was classic Olivia, always chasing the next best thing, never staying when times got tough. So there was my dad, left with nothing. His wife had abandoned him. His daughter was caught in serious legal trouble, and he was drowning in debt. I remember thinking, well, that's what happens when you make the wrong choices. And yeah, maybe that sounds harsh, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for him, not after everything he put me through. Then, out of nowhere, I got a text from my dad. This time, it wasn't like those cold, formal messages he sent before. There was a sense of desperation in it. He asked if we could talk, said he needed to explain everything. I didn't reply right away. I mean, what was there to discuss? He chose Olivia and her so-called perfect life over me, and now that it was collapsing, he wanted to reconnect. I wasn't interested in being his rescuer. But then, a week later, he sent another message, and this one hit harder. He was asking for help, financial help. Can you believe that? After all that had gone down, he had the audacity to ask me for money. He mentioned that he was in a tough spot and didn't know who else to turn to. I stared at that message for what felt like ages, trying to wrap my head around it. I figured this was his last-ditch effort. With Olivia gone, Jess a mess, and his finances ruined, he was desperate. The same man who had never really been there for me, who had chosen his new life over his own child, was now asking me for a lifeline. It was hard to process, but at the same time, not all that surprising. When you build your world around someone else's desires, it can crumble just as quickly. I didn't reply. I couldn't. There was nothing more to say. He made his choices, and now he had to face the consequences. In a way, it was poetic justice. The so-called perfect life he constructed around Olivia had collapsed, leaving him standing amidst the wreckage. Meanwhile, I was doing fine. I had my own space, my own life, and I no longer needed him. That's the thing about karma. It doesn't matter how long it takes, it waits for the right moment to strike. And when it does, it doesn't hold back.